The vibration started in the soles of my feet and worked its way up to my teeth until my whole skull felt like it was rattling inside my helmet. It wasn't the deep, throaty rumble of the 3 Packard V-12s below decks that we were used to. This was something else. It was a high-pitched, screaming whine that tore at your eardrums, a sound that didn't belong on the water. It belonged at 20,000 feet. The smell hit me next, not just the usual diesel fumes and salt spray of the Surigao Strait, but the sharp chemical sting of high-octane aviation fuel running rich. We were doing 45 knots in pitch blackness, faster than any PT boat had a right to go, and we hadn't even opened up the specials yet. Up in the cockpit, Skipper Henderson's knuckles were white on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the phosphorescent wake of the Japanese destroyer ahead of us. We were closing, but not fast enough. The destroyer's stern dual-purpose guns were already ranging us, throwing up geysers of white water 50 yards off our port bow. The shrapnel hummed through the plywood hull like angry hornets. "Sullivan!" The skipper roared over the wind and engine noise, not looking back. "Hit the switches! Wake the demons up!" My hand hovered over the jury-rigged panel we'd bolted near the engine room hatch. I looked at Sal, my gunner's mate on the aft 40mm. He just nodded, grim-faced, blessing himself quickly. This was it. The manual said a PT boat hull would delaminate at 50 knots in chop like this. The manual said what we had bolted to our deck was suicide. I threw the 2 heavy toggle switches. The world behind me exploded in blue flame. The 2 Allison V-1710 aircraft engines, salvaged from wrecked P-38 Lightnings and welded right onto our mahogany deck, coughed once, then caught with a roar that drowned out everything else in the Pacific Theater. It felt like a giant hand grabbed the stern of PT-343 and just shoved. We went from 45 knots to 55 in about 6 seconds. The bow lifted so high I couldn't see the horizon, just stars. The framing groaned. It wasn't a boat anymore. It was a skip stone riding a cushion of air and sheer terror. We were closing on that tin can at a speed that defied physics. I grabbed the twin 50 cal mounts to keep from being blown overboard by the slipstream. The Japanese gunners must have panicked. The disciplined bracket fire turned into wild, sporadic bursts. They couldn't track us. We were moving too fast, screaming like a banshee. We were 3,000 yards out. 2,000! The heat from the Allisons on deck was searing my back through my life vest. I could see the individual rivets on the destroyer's hull plating under their searchlights. "Torpedoes ready!" Henderson yelled. This was November 1944. Somewhere in the Philippines, and we were riding the fastest, loudest, ugliest thing afloat straight down the throat of the Imperial Japanese Navy. To understand why we were crazy enough to strap fighter plane engines onto a 70-foot plywood boat, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in Detroit. By the time I was 16, I smelled like gasoline and grease 24 hours a day. I worked in a garage off Gratiot Avenue that officially fixed Fords and Chevys for factory workers, but unofficially, we did work for certain gentlemen who needed cars that could outrun police interceptors. I learned early on that an engine is just an air pump. The more air and fuel you can force through it, the faster you go. The limit isn't the engine. It's how much stress the metal can take before it becomes shrapnel. I learned to listen to machines. A piston ring about to go has a specific tick. A bearing starved for oil has a specific screech. You learn the language of metal under stress. When Pearl Harbor happened, I didn't rush to the recruiting office the next day like some guys. I finished the transmission job I was on, then I walked down and told the Navy recruiter I wanted to work on engines. They took one look at my grease-stained hands and the scars on my knuckles and stamped "Machinist's Mate" on my papers. I thought I'd be working on battleships or carriers, big turbines, clean engine rooms. Instead, they sent me to Melville, Rhode Island, for PT boat training, motor torpedo boats. They called them the Mosquito Fleet. They were expendable, made of mahogany planking, powered by 3 supercharged Packard engines running on 100-octane aviation gas. They were fast, heavily armed, and had absolutely no armor plate. Your protection was speed and a prayer. If you took a hit in the gas tanks, you didn't sink, you vaporized. But I fell in love with those Packards. 12 cylinders, liquid-cooled, absolute beasts of engineering. My job was to keep them singing in conditions that would kill a normal engine in an hour. Saltwater spray, tropical humidity, redlining them for hours on end. I got good at changing spark plugs in the dark while the boat was slamming into 6-foot waves. You learn to brace your body, become part of the hull, or you get thrown around like a rag doll. By the time we got to the Pacific in '43, the war had changed. The Japanese were digging in. The early days of wild melees were over. Now it was about interdiction. Stopping the Tokyo Express, Their destroyers and transports running supplies to isolated garrisons at night. We owned the day with our aircraft, but they owned the night. And the hard truth that nobody back home read in the newspapers was that their new destroyers were fast. Damn fast. A standard PT boat fully loaded with torpedoes and ammo, and maybe a little waterlogged after months in the tropics, topped out around 40 knots on a good night. The Japanese tin cans could do 38, sometimes 40 when pressed. If they had a head start, we couldn't catch them to set up a torpedo solution. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. We spent too many nights chasing shadows, pushing our Packards until the temperature gauges were pegged in the red, only to watch the enemy slip away into the pre-dawn mist. It was frustrating. It was dangerous. And it was getting guys killed because we'd pushed too deep into enemy waters trying to catch them, and then get caught ourselves when the sun came up and their Zeros came hunting. Our skipper, Lieutenant Junior Grade Henderson, was an Ivy League guy, Princeton I think, but he had a wild streak a mile wide. He hated losing more than he hated the Japanese. He was the kind of officer who read the rulebook just so he knew exactly which regulations he was breaking. After a particularly bad night in late '44, where we lost 2 boats from our squadron trying to intercept a convoy off Leyte, Henderson called a meeting in the canvas tent we called a briefing room. He looked terrible, eyes sunken, smelling of stale coffee and nervous sweat. "We can't keep doing this," he said, pointing at the chart on the table. "They're laughing at us. We need an edge." He looked at me. "Sullivan, you're the hot rodder from Detroit. If you wanted to make a Model T beat a Duesenberg, what would you do?" I shrugged, wiping oil off my forehead. "Sir, I'd drop a bigger engine in it, but we can't fit bigger engines below decks. The Packards take up every inch of space as it is." Henderson got a strange look in his eye. He pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was a sketch. It looked like something a kid would draw in the back of a comic book. It showed a PT boat, but on the aft deck, behind the torpedo tubes, were 2 massive, vaguely airplane-shaped blobs with propellers facing backward. "There's an Army Air Corps salvage yard over on Biak," Henderson said quietly, "full of wrecked P-38s and P-40s. Perfectly good Allison engines sitting there rotting in the jungle because the airframes are shot." The tent got very quiet. My chief mechanic, an older guy named Kowalski from Pittsburgh, just stared at the lieutenant. "Skipper," Kowalski said slowly, "begging your pardon, but are you suggesting we strap aircraft engines to the deck and use them as... what? Air pushers?" "Exactly," Henderson said, his voice getting tighter. "We keep the Packards for cruising, but when we need to close the gap, when we need that extra 10 or 15 knots to overhaul a destroyer, we fire up the Allisons. It's a booster rocket, Chief." Kowalski looked at me. We both knew the physics. A PT boat is a planing hull. It's designed to lift out of the water. But there's a limit. You push it too fast, the hydrodynamic forces get unstable. The boat starts chine-walking, rocking violently from side to side. Or worse, the bow digs in at 50 knots and the boat cartwheels, disintegrating into toothpicks. "Sir," I said, trying to be respectful, "the center of gravity would be all wrong. Putting that much weight high up on the deck, she'd be top-heavy. And the thrust. Those Allisons put out over 1,000 horsepower each, the vibration alone on the deck planking." "Can you do it, Sullivan?" Henderson cut me off. His eyes were intense. It wasn't a question of safety, it was a question of mechanics. I thought about the garage in Detroit. I thought about the time we put a Cadillac V16 into a Ford Roadster delivery truck. It was stupid. It was dangerous. It was the fastest thing on 4 wheels in Michigan for about 3 months until it wrapped itself around a telephone pole. "Yeah, Skipper," I said quietly. "I can do it. We'll need steel channel for mounting brackets, we'll need to run auxiliary fuel lines up to the deck, and we'll need to rig cockpit controls. It's gonna look ugly as sin." Henderson smiled, a thin, predatory smile. "I don't care what she looks like, Sullivan. I just care what she runs like. Get your tools." We called it Project Frankenstein. It had to be off the books. If the squadron commander got wind of it, Henderson would be court-martialed, and I'd be chipping paint on a barge for the rest of the war. We traded 3 cases of captured Japanese sake and a pristine samurai sword to an Army Air Corps supply sergeant for 2 Allison V-1710 liquid-cooled V-12s, complete with their 3-bladed propellers. Moving them was a nightmare. They weighed nearly 1,500 pounds each. We used a borrowed bomb hoist and a lot of swearing to get them onto the aft deck of the 343 boat. The next 2 weeks were the hardest work of my life. We worked mostly at night under tarps so recon planes wouldn't spot the monstrosity we were building. Kowalski and I became welders, fabricators, and aerospace engineers overnight. We through-bolted heavy steel girders right through the mahogany deck into the main framing members below to create engine mounts. We ran high-pressure fuel lines from the main aviation gas tanks up through the deck, praying they wouldn't leak. The biggest challenge was cooling. These engines were meant to have 300-mile-an-hour wind blasting through their radiators. On a boat doing 40 knots, they'd overheat in minutes. We rigged up a crazy system using scoops to force seawater through heat exchangers we cannibalized from a wrecked landing craft. It was a plumber's nightmare. The rest of the crew thought we had lost our minds. Sal, the gunner, would come back aft, look at the two massive engines sitting where his deck space used to be, shake his head and walk away muttering Italian curses. "Hey, Frank," he asked me one night while I was wiring the ignition harnesses. "If those props hit a big wave, what happens? They turn into shrapnel and slice us in half, right?" "Probably, Sal," I said, not looking up. "Don't worry about it. Just keep shooting that 40 Mike and let me worry about the engines." We weren't just mechanics. We were soldiers. We stood our watches, cleaned our weapons, and wrote letters home we hoped wouldn't get censored. I wrote to my mom in Detroit, telling her the weather was nice and the food was okay. I didn't tell her I was building a suicide machine because our lieutenant had a death wish to catch a Japanese destroyer. The fear was always there, a low-level hum in the background, like the generators on the base. You learned to ignore it or you'd go crazy, but working on the Frankenboat gave us focus. It was something we could control in a war where we controlled almost nothing else. When we finally fired up the Allisons for a test run at the dock, half the base thought we were under air attack. The unsheathed exhausts were short stacks right off the engine blocks. The noise was deafening, a ragged, tearing roar that spat blue and yellow flames 3 feet in the air. The boat strained against its dock line so hard I thought the cleats would rip right out of the pier. The vibration was incredible. Tools danced off the workbenches below decks. Henderson stood on the dock, grinning like a maniac. "That's the sound of victory, boys," he yelled. We took her out for her first sea trial on a moonless night. We cleared the harbor mouth on the Packards, running nice and easy at 25 knots. The sea was calm, just a long, slow swell. "All right, Sullivan," Henderson's voice crackled in my headset. "Let's see what your Detroit hot rod can do. Kick him in the guts." I was at the auxiliary control panel on deck wearing flight goggles and heavy leather gloves. I hit the starter switches. The Allisons whined, caught, and roared to life. I advanced the throttles slowly. The props bit the air. The push was immediate. It didn't feel like a boat accelerating. It felt like a plane taking off. The bow rose up higher and higher. The stern dug in. The noise was so intense it felt like physical pressure on my chest. We watched the speed gauge. 40 knots. 45. 50. At 52 knots, the boat started to chine walk. The bow began oscillating violently from port to starboard. It felt like the boat was trying to shake us off its back. "Throttle back! Throttle back!" Kowalski yelled, grabbing a stanchion. I pulled the throttles back slightly. The walking settled down. We found the sweet spot right around 50 knots. It was terrifyingly fast on the water. The spray hitting my face felt like gravel. We did a few high-speed turns, the boat banking hard, the air props screaming as they bit into the night air. It worked. It was ugly, it vibrated like a paint shaker, it drank fuel like a battleship, but my God, it was fast. We got back to base, the crew buzzing with adrenaline. Even Sal was impressed. "Madonna," he said, wiping salt from his face. "She moves like a scalded cat." Henderson was already planning. "Tomorrow night?" he said. "Intelligence says a big convoy is coming down the slot. Heavy destroyer escort. We're going hunting." That brings me back to that night in the Surigao Strait, the night the water demons were born. We had been patrolling for 4 hours, engines idling, just drifting in the dark. The tension on the boat was thick enough to cut with a bayonet. You sit there in the dark, listening to the water slap the hull, wondering if this is the night your luck runs out. Then the radar operator got a blip. Big, moving fast. We moved to intercept on the Packards, trying to stay quiet. We spotted them visually at about 5 miles. 2 destroyers and 3 transports. They were moving at flank speed. We maneuvered for a lead angle, but they spotted our wake. Their searchlights snapped on, blindingly bright, sweeping the water until they found us. Then their guns opened up. That's when Henderson gave the order to hit the switches. Now, at 55 knots, closing on that lead destroyer, the sensory overload was total. The roaring of 5 V-12 engines, the slam of the hull hitting waves, the blinding flashes of enemy gunfire, and our own weapons opening up. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. Sal was hammering away on the aft 40mm, the pom-pom-pom sound rhythmically punching through the engine noise. The twin 50s in the forward tubs were chattering, pouring streams of red tracers toward the destroyer's bridge. We were closing so fast the Japanese gunners couldn't adjust their fuses quick enough. Shells were bursting behind us. We were inside their effective range for the big guns now. It was down to their 25mm autocannons versus us. The air was thick with tracer smoke and cordite. I was glued to the Allison engine gauges. Temperature was climbing fast. They weren't getting enough cooling air. They were designed for 300 ms 4Cs, not 55. "Watch the temps, I'm Sullivan," Kowalski yelled in my ear. "Number 2 is getting hot." "Keep her running, Chief. Don't let her die," I screamed back. We were 1,500 yards out. The destroyer loomed over us like a steel mountain. Henderson was holding the course steady, right into the teeth of their fire. A 25mm round clipped our mast, showering down splinters. Another punched through the chart house, combing just inches from Henderson's head. He didn't flinch. "Stand by, torpedoes!" Henderson yelled. "Fire 1! Fire 2! Fire 3! Fire 4!" I felt the whoosh, 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 whoosh as the 4 Mark 13 torpedoes leaped from their tubes on the outboard sides. They hit the water with a splash and started their runs. "Hard aport! Get us out of here!" Henderson screamed, spinning the wheel. This was the most dangerous moment. Turning at this speed with those air props pushing us was uncharted territory. As the boat banked violently to the left, the starboard Allison propeller dipped too close to the water. The blade tips hit the top of a wave. There was a horrific crack-thump sound that shook the whole boat. The starboard engine over-revved wildly, screaming in protest. I slammed the throttle shut on that engine just before it tore itself apart. We were now running on 1 air engine and 3 water engines, limping away at 40 knots while still under fire. We looked back. The destroyer was turning, trying to comb the torpedo tracks. It almost made it. The first torpedo hit amidships. A massive column of water and fire shot hundreds of feet into the air, lit from within by a dull orange glow. The sound of the explosion reached us seconds later, a deep, aquatic crump that hit you in the chest. The destroyer broke its back instantly. The bow and stern sections folded upwards, and she began to slide under. We didn't stick around to celebrate. The other destroyer was turning toward us, angry. We ran. We ran with everything those engines had left. We later heard from Navy intelligence intercepts that the Japanese radio operators were screaming about being attacked by American water demons that flew across the water with wings of fire. They couldn't process a boat moving that fast. We made it back to base just as dawn was breaking. We were running on fumes. The starboard Allison was wrecked, bent prop shaft, cracked block. The deck framing around the mounts was splintered and warped from the stress. The boat was a mess. We were a mess. We were deaf, shaking from adrenaline crash, our faces black with exhaust soot and oil. When we cut the engines at the dock, the silence was overwhelming. Nobody said anything for a long time. Henderson climbed down from the cockpit. He walked back to where Kowalski and I were standing by the smoking remains of the air engines. He looked at the damage, then looked at us. He lit a cigarette, his hands shaking slightly. "Well," Henderson said, taking a deep drag, "the concept is proven. We never ran the Franken boat again. The hull was too stressed. The engineers condemned it. We went back to standard PT boats, back to the frustrations of being just a little too slow. But for one night, we were the kings of the Strait. The war ended a year later. I went back to Detroit, back to fixing cars. But I couldn't work in a closed garage anymore. The smell of gasoline made me jumpy. The sound of a high-revving engine would send me right back to that deck, feeling the heat of the Allisons and seeing the tracers whip past. I ended up buying a small farm out in Livingston County, repairing tractors, slow, low RPM diesels. That was better. I'm an old man now. Henderson is gone, Kowalski is gone. Sal passed away 10 years ago back in Brooklyn. I'm the only one left who remembers the sound of that boat. For 70 years, I didn't talk about it. Who would believe it? It sounds like a fish story. A wooden boat with fighter plane engines strapped to the deck? But it happened. We did it because we had to. Because we were young and stupid and didn't know it was impossible. I'm telling this now because I don't want that kind of ingenuity, that desperate, crazy courage to be forgotten. We weren't heroes. We were just mechanics and sailors trying to survive another night. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing that high-pitched scream of the Allisons, feeling the vibration rattling my bones, and for a split second, I'm 20 years old again, holding onto a machine that wants to kill me, racing toward an enemy that wants to kill me, feeling more alive than I ever have since. It was the worst ride of my life. It was the best ride of my life, and I wouldn't trade that memory for anything. You'd think after a night like that, after strapping aircraft engines to a boat and staring death in the face at 50 knots, the war would pause. You'd think the universe would give you a minute to catch your breath, maybe slap you on the back and say, "Good job, boys. Take a week off." But the war didn't care about our engineering miracles. It didn't care that my hands were still shaking so bad I couldn't hold a coffee cup without spilling it. The war just kept grinding forward, a machine much bigger and hungrier than those Allisons we'd welded to the deck. 2 days later, the Franken boat was stripped. The hull frames were cracked, the engine mounts twisted. She was towed to the boneyard. We were transferred to PT 355, a standard 80-footer, Elco built. She was a good boat, tight and fast, but she felt sluggish after the rocket ride we'd been on. The transition was hard. We went from being the hunters who broke the rules to being the hunted again. And the Japanese were getting desperate. That's when the kamikazes started coming in heavy. It was mid-December 1944. We were operating off Mindoro now. The heat was different here. Suffocating, wet, heavy. It felt like breathing through a hot, damp wool blanket. You sweat sitting still. You sweat sleeping. The fungus grew on everything. It grew in your boots, in the creases of your skin, on the leather of your holster. We smelled like rot and diesel fuel. That smell is the perfume of the Pacific. Even now, if I walk past a construction site on a hot summer day and catch a whiff of diesel, my stomach tightens. I'm back there, watching the sky. The mission profile changed. We weren't just hunting destroyers anymore. We were barge busting. The Japanese were running supplies along the coast in armored barges, hugging the shoreline where the water was too shallow for our destroyers. They moved at night, hiding in the mangroves during the day. Our job was to go into that shallow water, into the mud and the roots, and dig them out. It was knife fighting in a phone booth. I remember one night specifically, December 18th. The moon was a sliver, barely offering any light. We were drifting off the coast of a small island whose name I've forgotten, engines muffled, listening. That's the thing about PT service people don't tell you. It's 90% boredom and listening. You listen for the chug-chug of a diesel barge. You listen for the snap of a twig on the shore. You listen to your own heart beating in your ears. "Sullivan," whispered Sal, who was manning the starboard 50 caliber. "You hear that?" I strained my ears. Nothing but the lap of water against the hull and the distant hum of insects on the shore. "Hear what, Sal?" "Music," he said. "I swear I hear music." I thought he was cracking. It happened. Guys just broke. The lack of sleep. The constant fear. "Keep your eyes on the tree line, Sal. There's no music out here." But then I heard it. Faint, tinny, drifting over the water. It was a phonograph, playing Japanese military marches. It was surreal. We were 300 yards off an enemy-held beach, and someone was having a concert. It meant they were comfortable. It meant they didn't know we were there. Lieutenant Henderson, he was still our skipper, God bless him, hand-signaled for us to start the engines. We didn't use the mufflers. We wanted the shock. The 3 Packards roared to life, and we shoved the throttles forward. The boat leaped. We weren't doing 55 knots anymore, but 40 was fast enough when you're that close. We swept in toward the sound of the music. Then the traps sprung. They weren't comfortable. They were baiting us. The jungle line erupted. It wasn't just small arms. It was heavy machine guns, 20mm cannons, hidden in the tree line. Green tracers lashed out at us like whips. They hammered the water around us, searching for the hull. "Helm hard over, smoke, make smoke!" Henderson yelled. I was in the engine room, monitoring the gauges, but I could hear the rounds slamming into the hull. It sounds different when you're inside. Thwack, thwack, crack, like a hammer hitting a melon. Splinters of mahogany flew everywhere inside the compartment. I grabbed my grease gun, the M3 submachine gun I kept hanging by the hatch, and scrambled up the ladder. The cockpit was chaos. The smoke generator on the stern was pumping out thick, white chemical fog, but the wind was blowing it the wrong way. We were exposed. Sal was screaming, firing his 50 cal into the darkness, the brass casings cascading onto the deck, clinking and rolling. I saw the red tracers from his gun disappearing into the black wall of the jungle. Then we took a hit in the chart room. A 20mm shell punched right through the plywood. It didn't explode, but the impact threw Henderson against the wheel. The boat slewed violently to starboard, heading straight for the reef. "Skipper's down!" someone yelled. I didn't think. I just moved. I jumped from the engine hatch to the cockpit. Henderson was slumped over, blood pouring from a gash in his forehead. He was groggy but conscious. The executive officer, a young ensign named Miller who had been with us for 2 weeks, was frozen. He was staring at the tracers, his eyes wide as dinner plates. He was in shock. "Grab the wheel!" I shouted at Miller, shaking him by the life vest. "Get us out of here!" He didn't move. I shoved him aside and grabbed the wheel myself. I spun it hard to port, slamming the throttles to the stops. The boat banked, the starboard gunwale dipping almost to the water. We were running parallel to the beach now, a broadside target. I could hear the bullets zipping past my head, that angry snap hiss sound. One pinged off the armor plate around the cockpit. "Sal! Suppressing fire! Keep their heads down!" I screamed. Sal didn't need telling. He was pouring fire onto the source of the green tracers. The quad 20mm mounting on the stern, manned by a kid from Texas named Tex, opened up. The sound of that Thunderbolt turret was deafening, a rapid-fire thump, 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 thump that shook the whole boat. I saw explosions in the tree line. We were hitting something. We zigzagged out of there, hiding behind our own smoke. We ran for 3 miles before I throttled back. My hands were cramping on the wheel. I looked down. Henderson was sitting on the deck, holding a bandage to his head. He looked up at me, blinked the blood out of his eye, and grinned. "Nice driving, Sullivan," he rasped. "But you're still just a machinist." "Sir, right now I'm the guy keeping us off the reef," I said, my voice trembling. That night changed something in the crew. We realized that the water demon's trick was a fluke. This grinding, bloody, close-quarters ambush, this was the real war. It wasn't glamorous. It was dirty. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. It helps me justify sitting here, digging up these ghosts, trying to make sense of why I made it home and so many others didn't. We got back to base and patched the holes. That was the routine. Go out, get shot up, come back, patch the wood, drink bad coffee, sleep for 4 hours, do it again. But the dynamic on the boat shifted. Ensign Miller transferred out 3 days later. "Stomach trouble," the official report said. We knew the truth. He lost his nerve. I don't blame him. Who wouldn't? But out there, you couldn't have a weak link. A weak link got you killed. We got a new XO, a guy named Lieutenant Parker. He was different, quiet, a math teacher from Ohio before the war. He calculated everything. Fuel consumption, tide charts, firing angles. He didn't have Henderson's fire, but he had a cold precision that was reassuring. It was Parker who spotted the pattern. "Sullivan," he said to me one afternoon while I was cleaning the fuel filters. "The barges, they aren't just random. They're running on a schedule based on the moon phases." He showed me the charts. He had marked every contact report for the last month. Sure enough, every time the moon was in the first quarter, the traffic spiked in Sector 4. "So, we wait for them there?" I asked. "No," Parker said, cleaning his glasses. "We don't wait. We go in and mine the channel before they get there." Mining. It was the most hated job in the squadron. You had to go in slow, silent, drop these heavy magnetic mines into the water, and pray you didn't blow yourself up or get spotted while you were sitting ducks. It meant running the engines at idle, creeping along at 5 knots. We went out 2 nights later. The mission was to lay 6 mines in a narrow channel between 2 islands where the barge traffic was heaviest. It was dark, darker than the inside of a cow. We were creeping along, the exhaust mufflers baffling the engine noise to a low burble. I was on the stern, helping the torpedomen prep the mines. These weren't small firecrackers. They were 500-pound drums of high explosive triggered by the magnetic field of a steel hull passing overhead. "Steady," whispered Chief Kowalski. "Don't clang the chains." We were sweating buckets. The silence was heavy. You could hear the water dripping off the stern. We dropped the first mine. Splash. It sank. We moved forward another 100 yards. Dropped the second. Then the engine on the port side coughed. It was a sick sound, a wet sneeze. Then it died. The boat yawed to the left. "Port engine out," I whispered into the headset. "Restart it, Sullivan," Henderson hissed from the cockpit. I scrambled down into the engine room. It was hot as hell down there. I checked the fuel pressure. 0. The fuel pump had sheared a shaft. That engine wasn't coming back. We were down to 2 engines. Not a disaster, but not good when you're in enemy waters. I climbed back up. "She's dead, Skipper." "Fuel pump." "Damn," Henderson muttered. "All right, let's finish the lay on 2. We dropped the 3rd mine. Then the 4th. Then we heard it. Not music this time. Engines. Big diesels. "Contact," the radar man whispered. 2 targets, range 1,000, coming around the headland. We were right in their path, and we had 2 live mines still on the stern racks. If we took a hit on those mines, there wouldn't be enough of us left to fill a matchbox. "Jettison the mines. Now! Now!" Henderson ordered. We frantically rolled the last 2 mines off the rack. They splashed into the water. We armed them as they went, praying they wouldn't arm instantly. "All ahead, flank! Get us clear!" The 2 remaining Packards roared. We surged forward. But the Japanese barges, these were the big Daihatsu class, armed with cannons, saw our wake. They opened fire. We were running away from our own minefield, with enemy barges chasing us into the minefield. It was a geometry problem. Parker, the math teacher, was probably calculating the odds in his head. I was just holding onto the rail, watching the tracers fly over us. "Draw them in!" Henderson yelled. "Let them chase us!" We kept our speed just high enough to stay ahead, but low enough to tempt them. They took the bait. They wanted to kill the PT boat that had been mining their channel. The lead barge surged forward, its bow wave gleaming in the starlight. I looked back. The barge crossed the invisible line where we had dropped the first mine. Nothing happened. My heart sank. Duds? Did we set the depth wrong? The barge kept coming. It crossed the second mine's location. Nothing. "Come on," I whispered. "Come on, you piece of junk." The lead barge was firing its 25mm gun now. Rounds were hitting the water 10 feet off our stern. Then the ocean opened up. The third mine. The barge must have passed right over it. The explosion was different from a torpedo. It was a sharp vertical hammer blow from beneath. The 60-ton barge was lifted bodily out of the water, broken in half like a toy, and engulfed in a geyser of white water and black smoke. The shockwave hit us seconds later, lifting our stern and slamming us down hard. "Yeah!" Sal screamed. "That's how you do it!" The second barge saw its partner disintegrate and panicked. It tried to turn hard to starboard. In doing so, it ran right into the shallow water where we had dropped the fourth mine. Boom! A double header. We didn't fire a shot. We lured them into their own graveyard. It was brilliant, it was cold, it was terrifying. That night, back at the base, I sat on the edge of my cot, staring at my hands. They were covered in grease and soot. I thought about the men on those barges. I didn't see their faces, I didn't know their names. They were just targets, sparks in the dark. But they had mothers, too. They had guys like me, mechanics, trying to keep their engines running. It's a strange thing, empathy in war. You have to kill it to survive, but it keeps creeping back in when things get quiet. You start wondering if the guy you just blew up liked baseball, or whatever the Japanese equivalent was. You wonder if he was scared. I pulled out a picture of my girl, Sarah, back in Detroit. She was working at the Willow Run bomber plant, riveting B-24s. Rosie the Riveter, she called herself in her letters. I looked at her smiling face, the curls in her hair. She seemed to belong to a different species than me now. She was building machines to win the war. I was using machines to kill people. There was a gap growing between us, a gap filled with salt water and cordite, and I was terrified that when I got home, if I got home, I wouldn't know how to bridge it. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. It's hard to explain this stuff to people who weren't there. The war dragged on into 1945. The Philippines campaign was brutal. We moved from island to island. The Japanese resistance got stiffer, more fanatical. We started seeing things that turned your stomach. Villages burned, civilians caught in the crossfire. In February 1945, we got a mission that wasn't about killing. It was a rescue. Intelligence had word of a downed P-38 pilot, one of ours, hiding out on a small island occupied by a Japanese garrison. The local guerrillas had him. They needed an extraction. This was personal. We loved the P-38 pilots. They were our guardian angels. When the Zeros came down on us during the day, it was the P-38s that chased them off. We owed them. We went in at 0200 hours. We used a rubber raft to paddle ashore. Engines cut a mile out. Me, Sal, and a guerrilla guide named Mateo. I carried a Thompson submachine gun and a medical kit. Sal had his carbine. The jungle at night is a living thing. It breathes. It watches you. Every vine is a tripwire. Every shadow is a sniper. Mateo moved like a ghost. We stumbled behind him, boots sucking in the mud. We found the pilot in a small clearing, hidden under a lean-to of palm fronds. His name was Captain Reynolds. He was in bad shape. His leg was broken, compound fracture, bones sticking through the skin. It was infected. He was burning up with fever. "Navy?" he whispered, his eyes glassy. "Yeah, Captain," I said, kneeling beside him. "The taxi's here." "About damn time." He grinned weakly, then grimaced in pain. We couldn't walk him out. We had to carry him. A mile through dense jungle at night, with a Japanese patrol searching for him. We made a stretcher out of 2 saplings and our shirts. Sal took the front, I took the back. It was heavy. Reynolds wasn't a small guy. Every step was agony for him, but he clamped his mouth shut, biting on a piece of leather Mateo gave him. We were halfway back to the beach when we heard voices. Japanese. Close. Mateo signaled us to stop. We lowered the stretcher into the ferns. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The patrol was coming down the trail we were on. Flashlights sweeping the trees. We had nowhere to go. If we moved, they'd hear us. If we stayed, they'd step on us. I looked at Sal. He was gripping his carbine, his face pale in the moonlight filtering through the canopy. I looked at Reynolds. He had passed out from the pain. I tapped Sal's shoulder and pointed to a large banyan tree with massive twisting roots about 10 yards off the trail. We dragged the stretcher behind the roots inch by inch. The patrol passed us. 6 men. I could smell their cigarettes. I could see the bayonets fixed on their Arasaka rifles. One soldier stopped right in front of our hiding spot. He unbuttoned his trousers and relieved himself against a tree not 5 feet from where Reynolds' head was lying. If Reynolds woke up and groaned, if he coughed, we were dead. I put my hand over Reynolds' mouth, praying. The soldier finished, buttoned up, and jogged to catch up with his squad. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for an hour. My hand was shaking so bad I had to grip my other wrist to stop it. We got him to the beach. The raft ride back to the PT boat felt like the longest voyage of my life. When we hauled him onto the deck of the 355, the doc, our pharmacist's mate, took one look at the leg and shook his head. But he got to work. We ran back to base at flank speed. Reynolds survived. He lost a leg, but he lived. I saw him 2 years later in a bar in Chicago. He walked with a cane. He bought me a beer. We didn't say much. We didn't have to. That mission stuck with me. It wasn't about the big explosions or the fast engines. It was about the quiet moments. The dragging of a stretcher through the mud, the smell of infection, the sound of a man pissing against a tree while you hold your breath and pray. It was the intimacy of survival. By the spring of 1945, the end was in sight, even if we didn't know it. We were tired. The boats were tired. The engines were worn out. The mosquito fleet was beaten up. But we kept running. I remember getting a letter from my brother, Eddie. He was in Europe with the 4th Armored Division under Patton. He wrote about the cold, the snow, the Battle of the Bulge. He talked about frozen feet and tanks sliding on ice. I sat there on the deck of my boat in 100-degree heat, swatting mosquitoes, reading about snow. It felt like he was on a different planet. "You guys have it easy," he wrote. "Cruising around on yachts in the tropics." I laughed. A dry, humorless laugh. Yeah, Eddie, a yacht. A plywood yacht loaded with high explosives, running on gasoline fumes where the sharks are waiting if you sink. We argued about who had it worse in our letters. The truth is, it all sucked, just different flavors of hell. But I had my engines. That was my sanity. As long as I could tear down a carburetor, as long as I could gap a spark plug, I had control. I could make something work. I could fix something. In a world where everything was being broken, cities, bodies, families, fixing an engine felt like a holy act. I developed a ritual. Every time we came back from a patrol, I'd wipe down the valve covers of the Packards. I'd talk to them. "Good girl. You got us home. You didn't quit." The other guys thought I was nuts. Maybe I was. But those engines were the only reason I was still breathing. One afternoon, a new guy, a replacement mechanic named Jenkins, asked me, "Sarge, why do you polish the copper lines? Nobody sees them down here." I looked at him. He was fresh, clean uniform, face still smooth. He didn't know yet. "The engines know, Jenkins," I said. "You treat the machine with respect. It treats you with respect. You neglect it, it kills you. Remember that." He nodded, looking a bit scared. "Good. Fear makes you pay attention." We were prepping for the invasion of Okinawa. The rumors were bad. They said the Japanese had thousands of planes waiting. Suicide boats, human torpedoes. They said it was going to be the bloodiest fight yet. I was 22 years old. I felt 50. I remember standing on the fantail one evening, watching the sun set over the Philippine Sea. The water was purple and gold. It was beautiful. That was the cruelest joke of the Pacific War. The backdrop was always paradise. You were fighting and dying in a postcard. Henderson came up and stood beside me. He was promoted to lieutenant commander soon, likely getting a desk job or a destroyer. "We've come a long way, Sullivan," he said softly. "Yes, sir. Long way from Detroit." "You think we'll make it?" he asked. It wasn't an officer question. It was a man question. "I don't know, sir," I said honestly. "But the engines are running good." He laughed. "That they are, Frank. That they are." That night, we got the orders. We were moving north, towards Japan, towards the final storm. If you're still listening to my story, I'd appreciate if you'd hit that like button and subscribe. It means these memories won't be forgotten. The Okinawa campaign, that's a whole other story. That's where the world truly caught fire. But before we get there, I want to tell you about the time we had to turn the PT boat into a tow truck for a submarine. Yeah, you heard me? A submarine. It was March 1945. We were on a standard patrol when we got a distress call. An American sub, the USS Darter, not the real name, names get fuzzy, maybe it was the dace, had run aground on a shoal while chasing a convoy. They were high and dry, listing, and the tide was dropping, and Japanese shore batteries were waking up. "Go assist," the radio crackled. "Get them off or get the crew off." A PT boat towing a 1,500-ton submarine? It was physics again. Impossible. But Henderson looked at me. "Sullivan, how much torque can we get out of these Packards without blowing the heads off?" "We can redline them for about 10 minutes, Skipper. After that, the pistons are going to swap holes." 10 minutes is all we need. We raced to the coordinates. The sub was there, a big black whale stranded on the coral. Shells were splashing around it. The sub crew was on deck, manning their deck gun, firing back at the shore. We pulled up alongside. It was chaotic. "Take a line," Henderson yelled through the megaphone. We passed a heavy hawser cable to the sub. They tied it off to their bow cleats. "All engines ahead, full! Give me everything, Sullivan!" I went into the engine room. I bypassed the governors. I stood there, watching the tachometers climb past the red line. The engines screamed. The whole boat shuddered. The stern dug in, churning up a mountain of white water. The line went taut. It sang like a violin string. For a minute, nothing happened. We were burning gas, making noise, and going nowhere. The temperature gauges pegged. 220 degrees. 230. "Come on!" I yelled at the engines. "Move!" And then, slowly, agonizingly, the sub shuddered. The tide was just starting to turn, giving us a little help. We pulled. The wood of our boat groaned. I thought the stern cleats would rip out. Inch by inch, the sub slid backward, scraping, grinding on the coral. Then suddenly it popped free. It floated. "Cut the line! Go! Go!" We cast off the cable. The sub submerged immediately, disappearing beneath the waves to safety. We were left on the surface, engines smoking, overheating, shaking. I idled them down. They were clattering. The oil pressure was low. We had cooked them. But we did it. The sub-skipper sent us a case of whiskey a week later. Best whiskey I ever tasted. These are the stories you don't see in the movies. It's not always about shooting. Sometimes it's about raw horsepower and refusing to give up. I need a break. My voice is getting raspy. But don't go anywhere, because next, I'm going to tell you about the kamikazes off Okinawa. I'm going to tell you what it's like to watch a plane turn into a missile and look into the eyes of the pilot as he tries to kill you. That's where the nightmares really come from. Stick around. There's more to tell.